From Perseus and the Kraken to David and Goliath, monsters have been a feature of storytelling fascinating the human psyche for as long as civilization has existed. They can at once be a reflection of our deepest fears and anxieties, while also being a manifestation of our greatest aspirations and triumphs. Scholars in the field of psychology and philosophy posit that humanity's fascination with monsters may serve as a therapeutic remedy to healing unconscious wounds and rectifying unspoken fears. By creating a monster, we open ourselves to the possibility of destroying it, and thereby conquering the underlying psychosis. For this reason, the monster movie as a genre of film has always fascinated me for what it reveals about the people and cultures by whom the monsters are created. And perhaps no pair of monsters are more storied in contemporary popular culture than King Kong and Godzilla. The great ape and the giant god lizard have always loomed large over cinema, having an immediate and enduring impact on audiences both east and west since the release of Merian C. Cooper's King Kong in 1933. And with the recent release of Godzilla vs. Kong, I wanted to take a look back at the original films that inspired this matchup to get a better understanding of what these monsters really mean. Much like the monster myths of old, these two films are much more than entertaining spectacle. They each reveal foundational truths about the societies that created them. And when analyzed together, Godzilla vs. King Kong represents more than just a clash of titans. It represents a philosophical battle between Eastern and Western thought on the very purpose of civilization itself. What does a monster film about a larger-than-life ape who was a king in the wild becoming a slave to civilization say about the society that created it? The original King Kong has many different artistic interpretations in both casual and scholarly circles, most of which tend to fall into one of three categories: racism, imperialism, or capitalism. And there are certainly allusions to all three of these concepts throughout the film. But these interpretations tend to characterize the film as a critique of these concepts. As I will explain, 1933's King Kong is A, not about any of these concepts individually, and B, certainly not a critique of them. King Kong represents a much more foundational concept that is related to humanity's inherent fears about the world. Professor Leo Braudy of USC generally characterizes monsters as falling into one of four categories. King Kong falls closely into the monster from nature category, which represents humanity's fear of an uncontrollable, natural world. With that being said, while Kong might be generally characterized as a kind of monster from nature, as a byproduct of a Western nation, he is much better understood as representing the state of nature, a concept that is at the heart of understanding Western civilization. The state of nature is a term coined by the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes in his seminal work Leviathan, which ironically enough derives its name from a biblical monster. It's a term that Hobbes used to generally characterize the human experience prior to the advent of civilization and government, a time where we didn't live in large groups and thus were exposed to the purest elements of nature: hunger, predation, violence, and an overarching sense of uncertainty about the future. In Hobbes' estimation, societal compacts are a sort of evolutionary progression, in which humans learn that by banding together, and perhaps, yes, sacrificing a degree of individual liberty, that they could collectively gain security from and ultimately overcome the state of nature. His thinking was especially influential on the beliefs of the American founding fathers, and helped them to craft a system of representative government that could both safeguard the collective group while maintaining individual liberties. Hobbesian theory thus captures a sentiment foundational to understanding Western civilization. In the Western mindset, civilization is not a virtue in and of itself, but rather a necessary evil that humans only reluctantly accept to avoid a more terrifying alternative. But paradoxically, although civilization is meant to cure the omnipresent violence of the state of nature, violence is precisely the mechanism by which Western civilization achieves that end. 1933's King Kong is essentially a dramatization of this very conflict between the state of nature and civilization. Rather than literally being a giant monkey, King Kong instead is best understood as a kind of avatar that represents the state of nature in its totality, as opposed to any one particular part of it. From the dangerous world he inhabits to the primitive customs of the indigenous who worship him, Kong is everything that modern civilization, supposedly, is not. Disorderly, violent, chaotic, and destructive. And yet, throughout the film, these primitive and modern worlds are purposely contrasted against one another, revealing more similarities than differences. This is no better represented than in the film's main conflict between Carl Denham and Kong. At the beginning of the film, we're given a brief profile of who Carl Denham is during a conversation between a sailor and an agent representing Denham's theater company.
Are you going on this crazy voyage?
What's crazy about it?
I don't know, but everybody around here is talking about that crazy fella that's running it.
Carl Denham?
Guess that's the name. They say he ain't scared of nothing. If he wants a picture of a lion, he just goes up to him and tells him to look pleasant.
Before we even see him on screen, this dialogue suggests that Denham is an imposing and aggressive character who is willing to go to any lengths to achieve his filmmaking aspirations. As the film progresses, we see that this preoccupation with filmmaking borders on manic obsession, frequently causing him to engage in morally questionable and even violent behavior. True to the sailor's earlier statement, Denham's own description of his photography methods reveals a complete disregard for the lives or consent of his animal subjects.
I tell you, there's something on that island that no white man has ever seen.
And you expect to photograph it?
If it's there, you bet I'll photograph it.
Suppose it doesn't like having its picture taken.
Well, now you know why I brought along those cases of gas bombs.
Do you always take the pictures yourself?
Ever since the trip I made to Africa, I'd have got a swell picture of a charging rhino, but the cameraman got scared. That darn fool, I was right there with a rifle. Seems he didn't trust me to get the rhino before it got him.
He's always prepared to get the picture he wants, whether he has to sedate or kill the animal to do so. When they arrive on Skull Island, Denham's tactics are on full display, leaving a trail of animal carcasses in his wake as he leads the crew on their journey. And he's no more courteous with human beings, where even the slightly misogynistic Jack Driscoll considers it too risky taking Anne to the island without first understanding what awaits them. Denham is completely unperturbed by the potential danger of the island or its inhabitants because, as he's demonstrated, he's ready and willing to use violence to assert his will.
I'm going ashore with you, aren't I?
You bet.
I don't think she ought to go till we find out what's going on.
Now, wait a minute. Who's running the show? I found out from experience always to keep my cast and my cameras right with me. Never can tell when you'll want them.
Yeah, but you're crazy to risk.
Now, Jack, run along and deal out the rifles and ammunition.
Not to mention, Denham found Anne in the first place after having stalked outside of a woman's mission, hoping to find some pretty down-on-her-luck girl that would be desperate enough to join his crew last minute. And when he finally does find Anne, he basically kidnaps her right off the street.
Hey! Taxi!
Rather than starkly contrasting his animal counterpart, Denham's behavior actually reveals a great degree of similarity between not just he and Kong, but between the state of nature and civilization, particularly where the treatment of Anne is concerned. Anne Darrow is the catalyst for the film's main action and the critical ingredient that forces the natural and modern world to collide. She is particularly vital to the overall pro-Western civilization message of the film because she is its primary victim, and as such ironically stands to gain by being kidnapped by Kong. Anne's experience at the absolute bottom of the economic ladder thanks to the Great Depression hyper-emphasizes the depth of Western civilization's failure, and in so doing, creates an avenue in which Kong is, rather than her abductor, her savior. Throughout the film, every monster battle in which Kong successfully defends Anne is a deafening blow to the credibility of the society from whence she came. While he may have taken her against her will, he nonetheless defends her, provides for her, and safeguards her from every creature that would do her harm. In this context, Denham and company cannot afford to fail in their pursuit of Kong, because every obstacle he overcomes is a triumph that further exposes the inadequacy of a supposedly civilized world which fails to provide its people with basic necessities. In this way, the backdrop of the Great Depression almost becomes a character in itself, illustrating the omnipresent danger that the world could slide back into the state of nature at any moment. It's for this reason that many interpretations of the film consider it to be a critique of Western civilization, with the image of Kong atop the Empire State Building supposedly representing nature's triumphant victory over modern civilization. But when we compare the characterization of Kong in the original to that of the Peter Jackson remake, it becomes abundantly clear that the original was careful to avoid evoking any sort of sympathy for Kong or his primitive ways. Firstly, on a purely physical level, Kong is presented to the audience as being far more animalistic in the original. Notice the contrast between Kong's facial expressions. In the original, he has these chaotic, darting eyes and exaggerated expressions fitting of a wild animal, whereas in the Peter Jackson remake, his eyes can range from wild to softer and more sincere, representing a much fuller range of emotion. This isn't just due to the technical limitations of the time. The two exhibit markedly different behaviors as well, especially in their interactions with Anne. The original illustrates through both action and dialogue that Anne is nothing more than a trophy to Kong. He protects her only because he views her as his property, not because he cares about her safety. There are three key moments in each film which demonstrate this stark difference. First, when Kong takes Anne to his lair. In the original, this scene represents a moment of selfish triumph rather than the culmination of an act of selfless heroism. The choreography and camera work of the scene conveys a feeling of distance between the two characters. Kong, with his back turned, bellowing into the sky, is not celebrating the fact that he was able to protect Anne, but rather celebrating his own skill and dominance at having bested the other creatures on the island. The camera's wide shot frames Anne as small and unimportant, a toy to be played with for Kong's amusement and nothing more. In the Peter Jackson remake, the scene marks the turning point of Anne and Kong's affection for one another. Jackson's scene at first mirrors the original. Kong again sits with his back turned to Anne, but the feeling is much different. This time, the camera is close and intimate, cutting back and forth between close shots of both characters' faces as they silently communicate. Kong's expression is pensive, almost sad, and Anne searches for a way to cheer him up. In the end, she sits in the palm of Kong's hand and they share a beautiful sunset. The second scene is when Kong is captured by Denham and Company. In the original, Anne is thrilled to be saved. You can see she covers her face in fear when she learns that Kong is still pursuing her. As Kong is being subdued, Anne is already back on the ship and undoubtedly happy to be out of his sight. When she and Jack are back in New York on the opening night of Kong's reveal, she describes her experience with disdain and fear.
I don't like to look at him, Jack. It makes me think of that awful day on the island.
Contrast this to Peter Jackson's version, in which Kong's capture is presented as an incredibly painful emotional labor that Anne helplessly tries to obstruct. As she hunches over in anguish, it's as if the two are telepathically experiencing the same pain, marking a complete tonal shift from the original. Finally, during the climactic final battle atop the Empire State Building, whereas Kong simply falls to his death in the original, in the Peter Jackson remake, the two have one final heartfelt moment as they again share a beautiful sunset before Kong is gunned down. This is ultimately one of the reasons why, though a great film, I feel the Peter Jackson remake does a disservice to our understanding of the real meaning behind the monster of King Kong. The change in Kong's characterization in the Peter Jackson remake results in a common mischaracterization of the film's famous last line: "It was beauty killed the beast." In Jackson's version, the quote is essentially a kind of Shakespearean ode to the purity of forbidden love. It's meant to make us feel pity for Kong and to condemn the violence that kept he and his lover apart. But in the original, the quote serves as a perfect bookend to the message that the film had been espousing the entire time: that violence is not disdainful nor antithetical with modern society, but rather a necessary component to maintaining dominance over the state of nature. Denham, and by extension the entire film, does not shy away from illustrating the parallel violence of the natural and civilized world. Take this statement for example.
It's a different thing taking a girl into danger.
Then I suppose there's no danger in New York. Listen, there are dozens of girls in this town tonight that are in more danger than they'll ever see with me.
What Denham does here is illustrate that both the natural and civilized worlds are and will always be dangerous, as danger, conflict, and violence are simply endemic to life on Earth and cannot be totally eliminated. But there's an important difference between the two that Jack Driscoll points out in response.
Yeah, but they know that kind of danger.
This is the fundamental difference between Hobbes's state of nature and civilization. In the former, violence is uncontrollable and unpredictable, but in the latter we can inject order and logic to our violence that allows for the maintenance of some semblance of order. A criminal who murders can be put to death. A neighboring country that ignores sovereign borders can be invaded. These are the methods of violence which Western civilization embraces. And insofar as Kong couldn't be controlled, he had to be destroyed. It Was Beauty Killed the Beast is not meant to be a romantic statement, especially not coming from Denham, who already expressed his disdain for romance earlier in the film. The statement instead vindicates Denham's cutthroat mindset as the only way to survive in a dangerous world. It argues that victory is reserved only for those who are willing to be more brutal in their methods to achieve it. After all, in the original King Kong, the airplanes that shoot Kong off the Empire State Building don't just appear out of thin air as they do in the Peter Jackson remake. Denham is the one who suggests it. The Arabic proverb which opens the film aids in this pro-violence interpretation, as its use of the phrase "stayed his hand" directly attributes the beast's decision to abstain from violence as the cause of his downfall. So rather than condemning violence, the iconic final lines of the film actually condemn those who are unwilling to use violence. It is no coincidence, for example, that Anne is kidnapped by the natives precisely at the moment that Jack Driscoll, who up to that point had mostly ignored her and remained focused on his mission, finally lets his guard down and professes his love for her. Thus, the final lines serve as a larger metaphor for the film's commentary on Western civilization. It argues that civilization requires constant vigilance and an unquestioning willingness to be brutal in its methods in order to keep society from falling back into the state of nature. In this way, you can see how racism, imperialism, and even unfettered capitalism, rather than being condemnable, would be justified under this line of thinking. Because no matter its faults and no matter how many individual victims it may claim, civilization is still the best solution for the collective survival of the human race. This philosophy touches on the very essence of Western civilization as it has existed up to this point. Especially in America, whether it's juxtaposing the Bill of Rights with the Trail of Tears or the Declaration of Independence with slavery, Western civilization seems perennially marked by a contradiction between the progressive values it espouses and the primitive methods it utilizes in support of them. In this way, 1933's King Kong reflects a quintessential feature of Western civilization, a paradox wherein humanity can only escape the state of nature by embodying it. To destroy the monster which it fears most, it must become it.